Hello there. According to Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, only they can save the NHS from being sold off to Donald Trump and big US Pharma. The truth, though, is that the NHS has already been sold off to the European Union. With all the huff and puff from both Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson, you would think that the NHS was some sort of self-contained asset that was in danger of either being sold off cheap as a single unit or being chopped up and given away bit by bit for political reasons. And Corbyn has been on a major offensive against Boris Johnson with this one, claiming that just about the only reason that the Tories backed Brexit was so that they could give the US President Donald Trump an early Christmas present of our health service so as to make all his rich pharmaceutical buddies even wealthier. Even though President Trump himself denies wanting to take over the NHS. But of course, Labour's Barry Gardiner has come straight out and said that the NHS is being undermined by stealth and that he doesn't believe what Trump is saying. And worse, Labour is claiming that in the process of selling off the NHS to the US, the Tories would purposely ensure that the cost of healthcare rose to hideous levels, so forcing us in the end to charge patients for operations, giving birth and what have you. And as a result, for differing reasons, both Labour and the Tories have been stating and restating to anyone that will listen that the NHS is not for sale. The Tories are saying it's safe to vote for them because they will keep pumping money into the NHS, and that there never have been, there are not, and there never will be plans to sell off the NHS. While Labour is saying only a vote for them will prevent the NHS being sold off by Boris. But as Brexit Party MEP and former chair of the General Dental Practice Committee, Henrik Overgaard Nielsen, says in The Telegraph, the reality is that the NHS is already for sale and has been for decades. EU directives and Tony Blair's obsession with testing the market are to blame. But first, what does selling off mean here? Well, as I see it, what it means is that a totally taxpayer-funded health service would be opened up to the market so that profit-making firms could be paid with taxpayer money for offering medical goods and services to the NHS. That way, claims the left, fat cat bosses and shareholders bleed us dry while the NHS fails. When what the left did under Blair was set up onerous PFI contracts that left us in the position of fat cat bosses and shareholders bleeding us dry while the NHS failed. What the left now seems to want is for all goods, services and personnel used and offered by the NHS to be owned or employed by the NHS. But the trouble is that this was never actually the case. And since we signed up to the EU public procurement directives in 2016, we have even less control now than we did. The idea behind those directives is to simplify EU-wide procurement rules and make it easier for any company in the EU to bid for and secure contracts so as to prevent binational policies and promote the free movement of goods and services. And further, the EU states that public procurement is becoming a policy strategy instrument. Under the new rules, public procurement procedures will also help public purchasers to implement environmental policies as well as those governing social integration and innovation. Put simply, that means political manipulation at an EU level via public procurement using taxpayer money, which could end up meaning that our UK healthcare policy gets driven more and more by EU procurement rules as they morph and adjust in the future, if we end up with no Brexit. And let's consider the possibility, post a Boris Brexit day, that the UK ends up in close alignment to these rules under Boris's yet-to-be-negotiated Brexit deal. we might still be left with little or no control over our own NHS despite Brexit. And that also applies to the emerging defence procurement system that the EU is so keen on, but that's another matter. As Nielsen says in his article, any goods and services that the NHS does not provide for itself must be put out to tender if its value is over a certain level, and they have to be open to bids from any EU-based company. And this isn't just about buying in medicines and loo rolls. This is also about where chemists, dentists and opticians offer their services as independent contractors. But it goes further, as we have basically privatised the procurement of our doctors and nurses. We don't train enough doctors and nurses in the UK, so what we do is we travel the world with our big, fat, imperialistic NHS chequebook and buy everybody else's, because it's a cheaper option. Now, if that's not healthcare capitalism on steroids, then what is? How can that not be a huge example of the rich using its buying power to ensure its own comfort at someone else's expense? But the left cheer that one along because they want diversity above all else, even if it leaves the elderly and the sick children of foreign lands without healthcare professionals. You can imagine a parent in a far-off land holding her starving young TB-ridden child and asking what happened to her doctor and nurse, just to be told that they'd been offered a nice package to go to the UK to treat our population for problems caused by obesity and alcohol consumption. That'll make her happy, won't it? I'm sure that information will make her sleep more soundly at night, the knowledge that the UK can use its wealth to remove her child's access to healthcare. And I've said it before, one day down the line there will be claims that the UK must pay compensation for robbing other people in other countries of their health professionals. So why Corbyn and his ilk are not demanding that we pay the country concerned huge amounts of money for every healthcare professional we take from them is a little puzzling. Unless they see an open-door immigration policy as a method of payback, of course. So all in all, even now at this moment, the NHS is up for sale, and much of it has already been sold off. And Nielsen gives us a couple of good examples of foreign corporations from even outside the EU that are US and Australia based that provide our NHS with very significant services. Now you could take the whole lot into public hands, all the chemists, dentists, the research and manufacture of medicines and medical equipment, from MRI scanners to the plastic spoons in the cafeterias, etc. But really, how cost-effective would that actually be? Although the lefties would love it because cost is not something they care one jot about. It's all about the communism and the diversity for them. Now, many people say they are fed up with the NHS being used as a political football by politicians doing absolutely anything they can to get re-elected. And many ideas have been bandied about, like putting a non-politician in charge of the whole NHS and giving them a budget to get on with it. Except that, who would appoint the person in charge and how much would that budget be? And it wouldn't change anything, as it would still be taxpayer money paying for it. So there would always be the usual, I can outspend the others mentality, as politicians promise to give the NHS more money than the other side will. Even if the whole thing was insurance, or even pay up front based, people would still demand the government step in to keep the cost to the patient down while dealing with medical negligence, etc. Health in the UK will always be a political football, however it is funded and whoever runs it. And that is exactly why politicians will do all they can to garner as much political advantage out of it as they can. And the trending political angle at the moment is that the NHS is somehow in a fire sale to Trump's big US pharmaceutical companies. And don't the left just lap that one up. But the real problem is that it is not the NHS that is being used as the football in this rather sordid political manoeuvring. No, the real political footballs in this nasty little game are the vulnerable patients who worry daily about their future availability of healthcare and the medicines to keep them or their loved ones alive. And all these recent claims by that vote-grubbing Corbyn of huge hikes in drug prices leading to possibly charging patients for their healthcare just to make US corporations richer really is beneath contempt, and actually unbelievable if you give it just a moment's thought. And as Nielsen says in his article, Corbyn should get his facts right, and because of the EU and the Labour Party's implementation of free market neoliberalism, our public services have been for sale for decades. The NHS is facing serious fundamental problems, and by focusing on irrelevant sound bites, the only people who lose out are the patients. Anyway, what do you think? Please share and comment, and thank you for watching.